Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Annie Campbell-Washington. I'm Senior Assistant Dean of Academic Programs and Dean of Students at the Goldman School of Public Policy. And on behalf of all of us at GSPP at UC Berkeley, welcome to this evening. It's really wonderful to see all of you here. I'm really excited for this conversation ahead. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the UC Center here in Sacramento, the Student and Policy Center, if you haven't been here before. It's been a real pleasure for us at GSPP to establish a new home here at the UC Center, and you'll run into some of my colleagues who are working here as well, and we've been running some more programs up here. So one of the programs that I wanted to mention to you is that we are working on launching our Master of Public Affairs degree program up here in Sacramento. So we're really excited about that. We're excited to be offering courses focused on agile government, focused on working in state government and bringing leaders from Sacramento into the classroom to work on developing solutions to public problems in real time here in state government. So we're excited about that. I'm going to be available here after the program if anyone wants to talk with me about that. But thank you so much for being here. The other thing that we've been doing is hosting more events. And so it's really exciting tonight that we have two such superstars in the room to be in conversation with one another. We have Wade Crowfoot, who is our Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency. Thank you so much, Wade, for being here. And leading this conversation will be Kate Gordon, who is the CEO of California Forward. She's also, I like to brag and say that she is on the Goldman School of Public Policy's Board of Advisors. Kate also has been working at the intersection of climate and energy policy and equitable economic development, was the former director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and senior advisor to U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. Since she won't have a chance to brag about herself tonight, I wanted to do a little bit of bragging about her before she gets started. But we're really thrilled to have both of you here. Thank you so much for leading this conversation. And just to set the stage a little bit, tonight we'll be talking about California's next decade of climate action, natural resources stewardship, and equitable economic opportunity. So thank you for being here. I know it's going to be an exciting conversation, and we're really thrilled. I also wanted to put a plug in for the Christmas tree lighting that's going to be at 7 o'clock just across the street. So we set that up as well. No, I'm just kidding. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, Berkeley is all powerful. They just control all the events around the state. And it's great to be here. So great to be back with my good friend, Wade Crowfoot, who is doing such amazing things up here. I mean, maybe to start, Wade, Secretary Crowfoot, sorry. With sort of a big picture question, you guys are 7 years into the administration. You've got another 13 months or so. How are you feeling? Like, if you're grading yourself on this, where you are in this moment, or just kind of, checking the vibes of where you are at this moment, how are you feeling about what you've accomplished and where you are?
Yeah, glad to unpack that. That's a big question. A lot of emotions with all we work on. But first of all, I wanted to thank Annie and the Goldman School. And really excited that you are bringing a Master's of Public Administration up to Sacramento. If you think about the work that we do in California state government, we preside over what is now the fourth largest economy in the world, right? A seeming nation state of 40 million people. Our agencies, a lot of you may work for agencies, make tough decisions every day, whether it's protecting the social safety net, the future of immigration law, protecting our pluralism in this time, safeguarding the environment. And we need as many smart people doing this work as possible, and the support of academics that are studying and holding us accountable. So I just think it's a huge deal. Goldman's making its way to Sacramento with this MPA, and excited to support that however we can. Yes, woo! And then just for, before I get into kind of that vibe check question, just for those that don't know the Natural Resources Agency, probably most of you know the setup of state government, but there are about 200 plus different departments in state government, and they all have their legal requirements. So many, whether it's Department of Motor Vehicles or Caltrans or in our world, the state park system or Department of Fish and Wildlife. And to actually manage those, state government, state leaders for a long time ago, grouped them all under agencies. So there are about 10 to 12 agencies, depending on how you slice it, these big agencies that manage large portions of the government. Ours is one of 2 environmental agencies in Sacramento in state government. We have our sister agency, which is California Environmental Protection Agency, Cal EPA. And the folks that work at Cal EPA are all about protecting clean air, clean water, protecting us against toxics and pesticides. And they act a lot like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We at the Natural Resources Agency are a big, broad agency, about 25,000 people, 26 different departments. We call ourselves sort of a stewardship agency for the state. So we include big departments that most everyone has heard of, like CAL FIRE, our state park systems, as I said, the Department of Water Resources, Fish and Wildlife. We also have the California Energy Commission, which is one of the leaders in driving this clean energy transition. We also have the California Conservation Corps. We help oversee not only clean energy planning, but we also fossil fuel extraction in the state through the Department of Conservation. We have 10 state conservancies that do work protecting, restoring our lands and waters. And we have important regulatory agencies like the California Coastal Commission that's actually meeting tonight. So really, at the Natural Resources Agency, our tagline is helping people and nature thrive together. And with that mission, it's been a crazy 7 years. Think about way back in 2019, Governor Newsom gets elected. He's the governor-elect and is actually with Governor Brown and President Trump in Paradise, California, at the Camp Fire, the deadliest wildfire that's taken place. Over the next 3.5 years, 8% of California burns, most of it through catastrophic wildfire. So this whole existential crisis of worsening catastrophic wildfire. Over the last 15 years, I should say, we've experienced 2 what are called millennial droughts, because science told us that they would happen once every 1,000 years, and we had 2 of them within 15 years. We collectively experienced the longest, hottest heat wave in the history of the American West. Happened in 2022. It actually disrupted our energy grid because there were so many people trying to stay cool that they exceeded the supply of the state. And erosion and sea level rise, not a future challenge, a current crisis. Rail service between Los Angeles and San Diego currently isn't taking place because of coastal erosion, in part driven by sea level rise. So you have that, you have COVID, you have the Trump administration first time around, the Trump administration second time around. So there's been just a lot. I talk about my job as, a lot of emergency response over the last 7 years. But, so that's the kind of what we've been dealing with. But then what's remarkable about California, and we'll talk about a lot tonight, is the way California is moving forward. On the environmental standpoint, the 4th largest economy in the world, running 2/3 on clean energy. The last year, 2/3 of the electrons powering everything, including these lights, comes from clean energy. That's remarkable. We have more uptake of electric vehicles, zero-emission vehicles, than almost anywhere else in the world. Over the last several quarters, over a quarter of new vehicles has been zero-emission vehicles or electric vehicles. We're driving forward on land conservation. We've conserved, protected more than 2 million additional acres of land in the last 3 years alone. Wildlife, while being threatened in some ways, is rebounding. We have fish thriving on the free-flowing Klamath River, where 4 dams were taken out, which is the largest river restoration project in American history, thanks to the leadership of tribes. We have salmon and steelhead, these migrating fish coming back into coastal streams that haven't seen those fish in decades. We have gray wolf that's actually rebounded and has restored its population in California. That's complicated with ranching, but it exists. We restored beavers to their native habitat after decades. So much positive happening in California, and I think the biggest challenge we face is how to respond to all that we face, particularly as a Mediterranean climate vulnerable to climate change, while driving forward at this important moment to show the world, what's possible.
Yeah. Oh, we're gonna unpack all of those things. So that was great, global answer. But before we do get into this sort of nitty-gritty of all those different pieces, which I do want to get into. Just personally, I worked with you around those fires at the early part of the Newsom administration. We've both been in government a while. I know how hard it is and how much energy it takes and how much passion it takes. We're also at a moment when government is under attack, right? People who are in government are under attack. How do you keep, first of all, was there an experience that kind of drove you to public service? Like, how did you end up here? And how do you keep getting up every day and keeping the passion and keeping the energy?
Well, I would say, you don't end up where you plan to be, maybe. I don't know. I was never one of these people that said this is what I would be doing. But my dad was actually a professor of natural resources at the University of Michigan. I grew up in the Midwest, and we'd go up every summer to this place in Canada. We had a cabin, no running water or electricity. Both parents were educators, so I spent a bunch of time outdoors. My path back to like resource protection and environment was long and winding, but I was always really interested in government. As a sixth grader, I went to a presidential rally. It was Walter Mondale in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I remember they stuck the little kids up front, so I got to shake his hand. And it was kind of he had kind of a soft handshake, as it turns out. But I went home, and if you remember those 1970s walls, you have like the faux wood. I stuck a bunch of stickers, Mondale Ferraro stickers, to the wall, but that are still on the wall in my mom's house. But I always wanted to be involved in government. I didn't know what it would really be. But I love it. If you work in government, to be able to wake up in the morning and spend a lot of time, hard work, and earn your salary actually doing good, it's incredible. That to me is, I'll always do this work, whether it's technically inside government or working with government. It's awesome. It's been a challenging set of years. Annie can attest. I didn't used to have as much white hair. We lived and worked together in Oakland, and I do feel like these jobs take some time off your life. But for all the right reasons, Well,
and it's so good to hear you say that. I think that one of the things I worry about a lot with what's happening at the federal level is that people are starting to think, oh, these jobs are not, like, they're risky, right? They have reputational risk. I might get fired at any time. And just being able to say, we have a huge government here, we're running this massive, essentially global economy, and it is meaningful, right, to be in these jobs. It is meaningful to be able to be there for 40 million Californians every day.
Yeah, I would say now more than ever in California. You and I were at Berkeley late last week, and there was a discussion around the state of democracy and science. And the fact is that, we live in alarming times. This erosion of the sort of the foundations of democracy on the federal level. Rule of law, separation of powers, protection of minority interests. And California is standing up, and I'll say our governor, our legislators are standing up. And so to stand up and say, yes, we work in government is a force for good, and we're going to do this the right way. Likewise with science, I'm so glad that Dr. Julianne McCall's here, who leads the California Council on Science and Technology, which brings together UCs
She used to
and
work
CSUs.
for me at OPR,
Yeah.
so
she's doing incredible
very
work.
proud.
And California is actually working with these guys to stand up for science and to deepen our scientific partnerships. So from my perspective, now is a really good time to live in California if you care about these values. But it's also a really important time to work in government because we need to hold strong and stand up for what's right.
No, I think that's so true. Work in government. Probably everybody here does, but tell your friends. Getting to some of the more kind of the policy stuff that you're working on. So I was just driving around the state. The last couple of days, I was in Bakersfield this morning. I was in Fresno this afternoon. I just got here. It's a very long drive. And then Ignacio Castillo, who's there, who came out of our Young Leaders Program, is working for an assembly member who has the entire district, Santa Rosa, to the border. That's 7 hours of driving. The state is gigantic, right? It's huge. I think I'm right about this statistic, but I believe that only about 6% of it is actually urbanized. So that's crazy, first of all. Second of all, what else is going on? What are all the land uses? What is happening? Why only 6%?
Yeah, well, we have 104 million acres of land in California, so we're a big state. A lot of that is in our Sierra Nevada mountains. A lot of that is in our Mojave and Colorado River deserts. A lot of that's the Modoc Plateau. So you
can't develop any of that. That's all basically undeveloped.
Yeah, but that being said, we have... the county of Los Angeles has more population than every other state but 9. So, from my perspective, there's a lot, there's a lot more development, including housing and infrastructure and manufacturing, et cetera, that can happen around these areas. We'll never have like a 50% urbanized, landscapes in California. And if we ever do, God help us, because we can't support that. But the beauty of California is you can live in a huge city or a place like the Bay Area or even Sacramento, and then you're an hour away from incredible nature. California is one of the world's 36 biodiversity hotspots. Scientists identify we have a broader richness of plants and animals and other life than almost anywhere else in the world. So the challenge we have is, how do we continue to grow our economy and provide opportunity and prosperity for 40 million people and more who will come, but then also protect these incredible landscapes and show the world how we can do both.
Yeah, I think that is it's such a huge challenge, and I'd love to dig into it more. We are the most urbanized state in the country with just 6% of our land urbanized. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
But we also, I'm often on calls, as I'm sure we've all heard, the kind of talking point on, Texas is like an abundance talking point. Texas is building all these renewables, and they're doing every day 1 million acres. In California, all these acres are very contested, right? Like, we've got a bunch of stuff that's protected. We have a bunch of stuff that's just mountains or desert. We have all the ag land. We have all the forested land. How are you thinking? Your job is really this question of how do you balance across all those land uses? And we're talking about sort of an acre of land could be housing, which is a crisis. It could be manufacturing, which we don't really have enough of in the state. It could be warehousing, which there's a lot of in the state, right? It could be conserved. It could be used for resilience. Like, how do you do that? How do you think about that balance kind of on a day-to-day basis? And how do you do that with other agencies? Like, what's the process to think about those really tricky trade-off questions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Texas is always the trigger when you work for the Newsom administration. So let me say something on that.
That's why I said it,
Which is, it's a good thing that actually Texas edged out California, bringing more solar and wind by a little bit than California, because it demonstrates that solar and wind are economical and that actually they're more competitive than fossil fuel equivalents, because Lord knows Texas leaders aren't adding solar and wind because of climate change. And I'll give California a lot of credit for actually its policy over 20 years driving down the cost of those technologies. It was the California solar incentive that actually built massive demand that increased the scale of production on solar. And independent people have been very clear that was consequential in driving down the cost. So,
and Germany.
And now China. But California's policy leadership has a role, and it's a great thing that now those technologies are cost effective. What I'll say on this question around how can we grow our economy, and what we'll need to do is double or triple the size of our grid, so that we're plugging in all the vehicles. Buildings in the future will be electric. We need to increase the size of our grid, and that's going to bring in a lot of energy. What I'll say is it's not a zero-sum game. We have enough land to effectively conserve our environment and protect our biodiversity, build the housing that we need to, bring on the clean energy infrastructure in smart ways. But what it does require is effective planning. We need to understand what are the places that are too sensitive to build on, what are the places that just make sense to build because they're already by infrastructure and jobs, and we need to make it easier. And what are those sort of middle areas that need more work? There's a great planning tool that we have in our agency. It's called the Natural Communities Conservation Plan, classic government acronym, NCCP. But the idea is it's rewarding governments, county governments that do planning, that create like a red light, yellow light, green light for the protection of threatened animals and plants. And so if they create this planning, so they have green light areas that are not sensitive for these plants and animals, these threatened plants and animals, build and make it easier to build. These red areas that need to be conserved, and they might need funding to be conserved, and then these yellow areas. So from my perspective, if I had a magic wand, we would create really good regional and county-based planning that would make it very clear for developers to understand where they can build and where they can't build. And where we want them to build, we make it far easier than it is right now.
Yeah, it's a great, just following up on that, it's an interesting idea. And one thing, Sarah Karlinski, who used to be at Spur and is now at the UC Berkeley Turner Center, wrote a big paper about sort of like the state should have a planning agency. I mean, partly to say, you're doing that over there, and then there's a state transportation plan that comes out over here, and then there's the scoping plan from CARB, and then there's a warehousing and freight plan, and they aren't necessarily talking to each other about land use. What's your thought on that? Like, how are you coordinating? The Strategic Growth Council obviously was created to do this, but how are you coordinating across agencies? How are you thinking about bringing that information from your plan into decision-making on economic development, decision-making on freight and transportation? Like, how does that all work together? Which I'm sure is imperfect because it always is, but.
No, I think you've raised like a fundamental tension in California, which is the tension between local government having land use control and then the state having statutory responsibilities for achieving certain things. And this has come to a head on housing because we know that we need to build more housing across California to address affordability. It is to some degree a supply and demand question. And if we're not building enough housing to keep up with the demand, then obviously things become unaffordable. And what we found was no one's against building more housing in California. Many people are against building more housing in their neighborhood or community. And so what Governor Newsom has done, and he deserves a lot of credit, and I'm no expert, is compelling counties and cities to build housing and to start essentially providing or imposing fines and consequences for communities that don't build housing. Nobody gets off by saying you got to build housing over there and not here. And that's really tense. And that's, the Attorney General has brought communities to court on this. But so from my perspective, I don't think in California we're ever going to throw out local land use control. And you don't really want that because communities should be able to, shape their futures. Yet there should be some, in my mind anyways, some sort of compelling guides that have a limit on that. And so as it relates to conservation, we've been really focused on more of a voluntary approach, this 30 by 30 approach to conserve 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030. We were at about 23%, now we're at about 26%. We're making progress. But there it's like local governments work with us, we have funding, create that open space in your communities. I think something's got to give, though, in the future with a little bit more prescriptive direction from state government onto locals if we're going to actually achieve these broad goals, whether it's clean energy infrastructure or housing or conservation.
Right, or climate resilience, which you talked about, but digging in a little bit on that. I'm glad you talked about 3030 because I was going to ask you about that, so thanks for bringing that up. But climate resilience is one of those areas that I think is so interesting from a government perspective because it's government, the public sector, that really holds all the risk of it, right? So except for insurance and utilities a little bit who pay for some of it, mostly if there's a disaster, it's you guys, right? Who are coming in, cleaning it up, doing the toxic mitigation. There you're paying for unemployment insurance, we're paying for relocation, there's food, like all the things, right? So there's a real vested interest in California, especially in a deficit environment, to think about resilience at a state level. But then, to your point, so much of the planning and decision-making on that is happening at the local level. How are you thinking about, you talked a little bit about wildfire and drought, flooding has increased in recent years. How are you thinking, and where have you seen progress in the state's kind of adaptation and resilience strategies? How is the state mitigating its own risk and costs when it comes to climate impacts?
Well, I'll say, I see my former colleague Michael McCormick in the room when we worked on this at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research 15 years ago. It used to be called climate adaptation. And climate adaptation was sort of a future planning exercise. It's like, well, what do we need to do as the climate slowly changes? And we fund a lot of climate science, and something we should talk about is the 5th climate change assessment, which is a science assessment coming out next year. And what we thought like 10 or 15 years ago is we would start experiencing really tough impacts by 2100, by the end of the century. And remarkably, scientists, the best scientists in the world that we were funding, predicted impacts in 2100 that we're now experiencing now. So we've moved from this notion of climate adaptation to building resilience, the ability to weather and continue to prosper with these impacts. And a lot of it has been emergency response, but we've been working desperately to get ahead of the curve. So on wildfire, it's a great example where, initial focus was how do we strengthen response? and with CAL FIRE, we have the strongest wildland firefighting force on planet Earth. We attack wildfires like the military, planes, helicopters, thousands of people, technology, AI. It's incredible.
Drones.
Yeah, but we also know that we're not going to respond our way out of this. So we established this big task force. It wasn't sexy, but I chair it along with the U.S. Forest Service. It's huge, it's inclusive, and the whole idea was to create this action plan around what we're going to do to get our arms around the management that we need. That's things like fuel breaks around communities that slow down the fire and let firefighters fight. It's planning in communities to ensure that there are evacuation corridors or that more buildings are being hardened from wildfire so they don't catch fire from embers. It's things like, something I want to talk about is really righting this historic wrong and actually bringing traditional ecological practices from Native American tribes back. Remarkably, the most cost-effective thing that we can do to reduce catastrophic wildfire risk is to restore indigenous practices back on the landscape, these low-level prescribed burning, cultural fire. For almost 100 years, my agency arrested Native Americans that were doing this, and now we're desperately trying to get this back on the landscape. So wildfire is a really good example of now we have like a broad action plan, and it's expensive, and it's at large scale.
Really expensive.
Yeah, but we actually know what we need to do to actually manage for catastrophic wildfire. Same thing on water, both on the water supply. We know we're going to lose about 10% of our water supply, is what science tells us, by the middle of the century. As a result of hotter temperatures, think more water evaporating into, or soaking into dry soils and evaporating into the air. So what are we going to do about it? We've got actually numeric targets around diversifying our water sources. Likewise with salmon, which is this iconic species that's been migrating back to California rivers for 10,000 years. Water temperatures heating up, we have a salmon action plan. So we have tried to take a really comprehensive approach with each of these threats. I guess last point I would say is we're not alone. I go to a lot of the international summits on these issues, and for years, like a decade, we talked to other governments around the world with Mediterranean climates like ours. So think like Spain, Greece, southern France, but also parts of the southern hemisphere with a similar climate, parts of South Africa, Chile, Australia. And guess what? We all are experiencing really scary wildfire, extreme heat, drought. So we pulled together 3 years ago this partnership, 15 governments from 5 continents that are addressing the same climate impacts because of the climates that we have. It's called the Mediterranean Climate Action Partnership, all focused on like how can we help each other build resilience as fast as we need to.
I have a secret theory that you guys created that because you wanted to go to Australia, Chile, south of France. You were like, where are all the countries I want to visit, and how can I align them into a partnership?
I have a colleague in the governor's office that calls it as the partnership of nice places to visit.
100%. It's like, I'm going to go to Greece today.
And they all happen to be wine-growing regions.
100%. Yeah. Like, it's just a coincidence. I love that partnership. There's so much to follow up on there, but I do want to follow up on the point about money, just because you come out of, and this is true across the world too, right? This is, as these impacts are more and more severe and frequent, we probably tripled our wildfire resilience budget in the last, if not more, in the 7 years you've been there. That's coming from somewhere. There's, the bond was great, Prop 4 was great. Thank you everybody who voted for Prop 4, drop in the bucket. Right? How are we thinking as government people, as policy people, how can we start to think about addressing these increasing costs of resilience, which right now the public sector pretty much bears? And that's, we're going into deficit. Most of the money is already allocated in the California budget. It's not like there's a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah, it's a big question. We're now experiencing the financial crisis of climate change. I was with Governor Newsom in Brazil at the most recent UN summit on climate change.
Once again, a country that you wanted to visit. I'm just kidding. I know, the UN had it there. It wasn't
the year before, it was in Azerbaijan.
Azerbaijan, yeah, okay, all right.
Not on my bucket list. But he said the climate crisis is the financial crisis, and it's true. Insurability in California is a huge issue as a result of wildfire. It's also a huge issue in Florida and the Gulf Coast as a result of hurricanes. And like chickens are coming home to roost on this impact. And it's worth noting that as these crises mount and are going, and think about this, if we can't get property insurance, then essentially that calls into question the entire real estate market and private property market, which is a huge portion and a huge foundation of our economy. Think the meltdown in the subprime mortgage crisis in 2009. So a state senator or a U.S. senator from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse, is like, he's more articulate on this than almost anyone I hear for like the regular person like me, like non-expert. And he's like, look, this is, if we lose the insurability of our property, then we are looking at an economic meltdown in this country. And of course, the federal government is completely asleep at the switch on this. And so in California, we're really working to figure out how we partner with the insurance market, for example, to bring back carriers to California to maintain affordability. And what's interesting is it's a numbers and cents thing for these insurance, the insurance sector. There's not one major insurance company that doesn't have climate scientists on staff. And that's because it's a dollars and cents issue. And so, they can't afford to be ideological. And what they say is, unless you are taking meaningful steps to quantifiably reduce risk, you're not going to bring the crisis into under control.
Yep. No, that's absolutely right. And I think it is really important that people are starting to realize that. Unfortunately, it's because of insurers withdrawing, right? People used to say, oh, they have annual policies, they can get out if something looks like it's getting bad, but now they're just withdrawing from entire markets. So really important thing to be focused on. And just a pitch for California Forward, we do a lot of work in this space on fiscal resilience, fiscal impacts of climate change and resilience. On that fiscal question, I mean, to your point, the governor has said it's a fiscal issue. I mean, Larry Fink from BlackRock famously said climate risk is financial risk. He also said 5 years ago that we would see the end of the 30-year mortgage for this exact reason, that people can't do a mortgage anymore with 30 years of lead time because the climate risk over the 30 years is significant and you can't control the borrower's behavior, right? So you don't know what the risk is. Interestingly, the president just called for a 50-year mortgage, so that seems even harder. But given this intersection between climate and economics, something you've worked on a long time, climate policy and economic strategy increasingly just need to be more integrated, right? Like we've got that fiscal impact of resilience. You talked a little bit about clean energy development as sort of, as we're thinking about energy transition, we have to think about offering jobs and a tax base and sort of opportunities for places that have been traditionally extractive places. From where you sit, kind of in your agency and also on these cross-agency collaborations, where's California getting that right, that intersection of sort of climate action and economic strategy? Where do you think we need to improve? Like, where do you see that going?
Well, I'll tell you where I think we're getting it right is we've developed an economy-wide, very clear roadmap to reduce carbon pollution, to achieve carbon neutrality, but in a very predictable way over the next 20 years. It's called the Scoping Plan. It's the California Air Resources Board. They update it every 5 years, and it identifies where we're going to reduce pollution in transportation, manufacturing, buildings, off our lands. Right now, our lands are a source of emissions, but if managed, we can reduce that and ultimately become a sink of emissions. So I think that's where we've got it right. And if you look over the last 15 years, independent research just came out that shows that we've reduced our pollution by 20% while we've grown our economy by 78%. That's my take. But I think,
at a high level, yes.
Yeah.
But a lot of our economy is based on the stock market and our top 1% of income earners, right? So the growing the economy may or may not be widely shared as a feeling or as a benefit. So just something to think about, like, have we actually created jobs and economic opportunities across the state? Is CARB the right agency to do that, to create economic opportunities?
I would say
how does that work?
My take is sometimes what I think is really important in my role to a question like that is to be able to, there's many things that we could do differently about, within agencies and policies, but the fact is California, has remarkable economic growth while being among the most ambitious towards carbon pollution reduction. And there's a lot of benefits that we have, including an incredible tech sector that's driven, the economy, et cetera. So I don't want to suggest that their entire, that we have that economic growth because of our environmental policy, but the fact is we can have both. And that's a really powerful message for the rest of the world, because there are plenty of entities, and I heard this, recently in the UN, whether it's fossil fuel companies or petrostates, saying we can't have both. And in fact, we have a president of the United States that's basically saying that. So the fact is, California is driving forward on this. I'll say something provocative, which is global capitalism will define whether we actually get the climate crisis under control more than governments will. Governments need to lead, but we have to figure out a way that economic growth doesn't externalize carbon pollution. And I do think the whole disclosure discussion, that's really hard for the private sector to have, but the idea is, if you're a company, we should understand your carbon footprint. And if you generate a lot of carbon pollution, you should actually fund ways to offset that. And we are seeing wealth creation almost unparalleled in human history, right? We now have trillion-dollar companies. We actually have somebody, an American, Elon Musk, who is on paper worth $1 trillion. And it will never be government and government funding that's going to be able to, fully, move the needle on this. If we can figure out a way that the Amazons of the world, that the NVIDIAs of the world, that the Googles of the world, can continue to prosper, but address their carbon pollution at the same time, but figure out ways that, the Amazon and the Congo Basin, can get paid to keep the very same forests in their countries that we cut down in ours. Like, unless we figure out a way that global capitalism can finance this transition, I don't think we're going to achieve it.
No, I think that's well said. And your point earlier about us creating a market for avoided emissions is super important, right? Because the only reason avoided emissions are valuable is because we decided that they were valuables, right? So how do we think about creating markets for other things? It's a great point. And I think just thinking about your agency, and then I want to talk a bit about some of the environmental justice pieces, but thinking about your agency and all the pieces you have, which is a lot. And I don't think it was 25,000 when you started. It's grown.
Yeah, it has.
It was like 19,000, wasn't it? That's amazing. You've got two...
Mostly firefighters, actually.
Mostly
that
firefighters,
growth
that makes
is mostly
sense.
firefighters.
Yeah, you've got two big pieces of this economic transition, right? I mean, you've got two interesting things that are kind of top of mind. You have CalGEM, Geologic Energy Management, which is dealing with, and CEC, Energy Commission, which are dealing with the, California is an oil-producing state. What does that look like going forward? How do we think about that transition? And then you've also got just the land use realities of data centers, right? Like, the tech sector used to not have a huge energy footprint in California and now is starting to have a huge energy footprint. Either of those, or neither of them, but either of those, you want to sort of talk a little bit about sort of how are you grappling with those, in real time? That stuff is happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super tricky energy transition across the world, but in California. As you point out, California used to be the third or fourth highest oil producing state. So if you drive to the southern San Joaquin Valley, think Bakersfield, and you go to certain places, you'll see we produce a lot of oil. But also, if you drive through Los Angeles, including Beverly Hills, there are oil derricks, a lot of them hidden, actually producing a lot of oil.
They look like warehouses, right?
Yeah.
Like they're behind. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and there's much more mitigation and visual cover in rich neighborhoods than there is poor neighborhoods, but that's another conversation. But point being, historically, we produced a lot of oil, and guess what? We consume a ton of gasoline. We're still a huge market. Many of us, continue to drive cars with gasoline. And so we don't want to be hypocrites and suggest that oil and gas aren't continuing to be really important. But then two is, if we're going to make this transition and we're going to expand the number of options, for example, for electric vehicles, and reduce the amount of gas that our buildings use, it has to be in an affordable way for average Californians. Because at the end of the day, Californians do want us to make this transition, but a lot of Californians are living paycheck to paycheck, or are not willing to sacrifice their livelihoods or quality of life or standard of living for this transition. So what we've got to try to figure out is, right now in California, over time since the 1980s, oil production has declined. And that's really more of a technical issue. It's more expensive. It's not as profitable to extract California oil versus some other oil. But as a policy measure, we've made it harder to extract oil in the last several years, and that now has threatened refineries that are taking oil and making gasoline.
We also have the oldest refineries in the country. Our refineries are 100 years old, so that's another factor there.
So, and we also have gas that's more expensive than the rest of the country for a bunch of reasons. But what we've had to contend with is, yes, we're going to drive forward on this transition, but we have to maintain gasoline affordability in the meantime. So it's been this really uncomfortable discussion where, yes, we want to move beyond fossil fuels, but we also have to maintain the infrastructure and work with the oil companies in the energy sector to enable this transition. One of our smartest people on this really talks about this as a middle transition. If you're in the early part of the transition, you set goals and you do some of the easy stuff. We're in the mid-transition, and we're seeing really the impacts of as this demand for gasoline erodes in California, with more people doing electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, we're going to see reduced profitability of refineries. And as those refineries close, how does that impact the price of gasoline? So we're in this really tricky transition where we're fully committed to minimizing the demand for gasoline, and we're never going to be an oil exporting state. So really driving down and out the production, but doing it in a way that actually maintains affordability in this situation.
Yeah, it's super tricky. It's one of those things where, and I know a lot of conversation at the UN conference in Brazil this year was about these trade-offs, right? I mean, we're in the mid-transition everywhere. So it's like, we did a lot of the behind the meter switching out the electricity to cleaner electricity, and now we're in the this is really hard. This is real infrastructure change and things that might become stranded assets and putting money places and not other places. It's super tricky, definitely not minimizing it. And I'm really glad you brought up the impact on just on people's day-to-day economy, right? I mean, affordability is apparently the new Democratic hoax, but it's also the key word of the day. 60%, I think, of people in the United States live paycheck to paycheck, and it's higher in California. It's actually 70-something. Planning, you and I are both planners, we love planning. We're planning geeks. But planning historically has often run over underserved communities and people who don't have the ability to kind of participate. How are you working, and I know you're doing a lot in the Newsom administration and at your agency, how are you working to ensure the dollars you're investing, the decisions you're making are reaching regions and communities that have been left behind? You've done so much with tribal communities, so I'd love to hear about that. But just in general, how are you thinking about sort of environmental justice, tribal justice, not as a slogan that you roll out at press conferences, but really as a lived experience of the agency?
Yeah, well, I would start by saying I've been frustrated to see this narrative that somehow elected officials shouldn't be talking about climate change if they want to get elected, whether that's for president or the next governor. I actually think that's kind of insulting to Americans. I think we can prioritize affordability and talk about climate change. I don't think it's like sticking our head in the sand for 5 years because affordability issues are paramount. I think we could say, look, our folks are facing threats and impacts, financial impacts because of climate change. And whatever we do on climate change needs to be done first and foremost with an eye towards affordability. So I guess that's one point. Another point I make is I'm really proud of where California has come on prioritizing burdened communities, either communities that basically got the short end of the stick with most pollution because they were Black or brown communities and or poor communities. There's more focus on actually driving funding into those communities on real solutions and reducing pollution in those communities. We just passed, but also, so that's one sort of profile of community. Many of those same communities are most vulnerable to climate change because the fact is, vulnerability is based on geography, but it's also based on income. In Los Angeles, on a very hot day, the temperature in Beverly Hills can be 10 degrees cooler than the temperature in South LA or South Central LA because of the green vegetative cover. So in that climate bond that the voters just passed, $10 billion, they identified 40% of that, $4 billion, has to go to essentially a small portion of California communities that are most vulnerable to climate change. And that's much like the funding from our program to cap pollution and invest it, called Cap and Trade or Cap and Invest. A portion of that has to go to our disadvantaged communities. So that's a big deal. I think in our agency, we're not running away from environmental justice or equity, despite it being weaponized by the federal government. But I do think we're talking about it in different ways. So, we're working on finalizing our updated equity and environmental justice plan. And yes, it will have that, we're not running away from those, but we're calling it helping all Californians thrive or something like that, where we're breaking down and saying, what does this mean? And so at our agency, it means three things. One is ensuring communities can shape the decisions that impact them. So actually being much better about bringing communities in early in the decision making, so decisions aren't happening to them. Two, it's about ensuring that all communities actually can access funding from the state, because it's been a game historically where it's the complicated system. So the most well-resourced communities also are best positioned to get the money. So really, prioritizing communities, providing technical support, capacity building. And then third is we hire 25,000 Californians, and they do not reflect California. And so we have not availed ourselves of the full talent pool of California, because we are not seen as like an open and inclusive employer. So how do we build pathways so that all the talented Californians actually have access, and we continue to choose the best for each job by taking advantage of that whole pool? So to me, like, that's stepping up, and that's actually, but explaining it as such. When somebody says, you're against equity, and I say, am I against every Californian actually having a shot to live like a healthy, safe, and meaningful life? Because that's what equity means to me. What does DEI mean? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's a bad word. No, it's not. It's about celebrating the unique heritage that makes us uniquely American. We just had a cultural heritage celebration at our agency last week, and we love the fact that our employees have heritage that comes from over 150 different countries. That's a source of strength. We shouldn't apologize about that. But we should be able to explain it in ways that are not just using buzzwords that have been
demonized.
weaponized.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And it wasn't on my list of things I wanted to ask you, but now I have to, because you talked a little bit about sort of one way in which I think historically many people in the policy world have tried to counteract some of the distrust from the past, right? From highways through cities and other things. You come out of the Oakland government, that's a prime example of highways through cities. Has been to building process, right? Like building in permitting processes, building in community engagement processes. And then now there's this like abundance narrative that I don't think is this, but has been taken by some people to be about getting rid of all that process, right? How do we build fast? How do we move faster? How do we deploy? How are you, is the abundance framework like coming into your life in a significant way? How are you managing that balance?
Yeah, it's in a huge way. And abundance, of course, is the name of the book that recently was written, which used California as sort of a cautionary tale for creating too much process.
It was basically about California, and then it pretended to be about the nation, but yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That could be.
I think that's you.
Oh, sorry.
You're done.
And look, guilty as charged. I mean, I think we're not trying to be overly defensive. The fact is, we have to move quickly to build things in California, whether it's more housing or clean energy, or do things like conservation. And we made it tough on ourselves, because a lot of well-meaning laws and regulations over time stack on each other. And what they mean is it's really hard to get things built. And in some cases, things can't get built. That being said, two things can be true at once. We also need to ensure that communities, impacted communities, Native American tribes with ancestral homelands there, actually have notice, and there is process to ensure that their needs and their concerns don't get run over. I think it requires, so it's not about just simply throwing out CEQA and just letting this be a low regulation state, but it is about how we do this in a smart way. So I'll give you an example. We have a desperate need to get wildfire safety projects done quickly. And right now, a wildfire safety project around a community is subject to a number of state laws. CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, the Endangered Species Act, if it's along the coast, the Coastal Act, and about eight other laws. And in some cases, getting that fuel break, the planning on that can take 2 years and up to a third of the project budget. We can't have that happen, because we're losing the plot. We're losing the game if we actually don't get these projects in time enough to prevent what happened in Los Angeles last winter, or these catastrophic wildfires. But we're not going to throw out environmental protections. So in this case, the governor essentially directed us to create a process to suspend all of those requirements if the project implementer agrees to a 13-page environmental protection plan that also includes notice to impacted tribes and communities and a role for them. So the idea is you're not going through 2 years and literally thousands of pages of analysis, but you are signing on the dotted line with legal sanctions if you violate this. We're going to abide these 13 pages of environmentally protected measures and community notice. And remarkably, we've under the suspension process since May, we've enabled over 200, about 200 projects at about 50,000 acres of projects. And those are projects that are going to happen in weeks or months when they would have taken years.
That's awesome. That's a great example. I love the practicality of it too. And just, I know we're winding a little bit down, so one question I wanted to ask, there's a number of young folks here who are kind of early in their careers in policy. You've worked at the city level, you've worked at the state level, you've actually run a foundation, lots of different ways in. What has surprised you most about what it takes to get stuff done here in Sacramento?
I feel like, sometimes you lose sight of the forest for the trees. I've been here like 15 years doing this work, so I'm like, that's a really good question.
Or what is it people don't realize who are out there? What would surprise
I don't know.
other people?
I'm always amazed how smart state workers are. And I'm not just saying that because some of you are state workers. We bureaucrats get a bad rap, right? And I think that there's a lot of people that are tearing down government. And I find people that I work with in government, frankly, sometimes a lot smarter and capable than the entities that are coming in from the private sector. And what boils my blood is this notion, and frankly, naming names, Elon Musk, when he sent that letter to federal workers and said, go from a low
fork in the road letter.
Yeah, fork in the road. Go from a low production career to a high production, and that's not only insulting, but it's patently wrong. So I think it's smart people. I also think if you're a young person in considering, here's the advice I would give if you're not in government is, get experience in government because it'll let you work in a number of different places. Like the experience you're getting at the legislator's office. Huge, because you will be so consequential. If you want to go work at a non-governmental organization, great. If you want to go work at an association of businesses, great. But like this government is opaque. Government is always hard to understand, whether it's local government. For me, the federal government is hard to figure out, right? So I know state government is hard to figure out. So I would say, piece of advice is, and even mid-career people, like go find that opportunity to work in government. Maybe get appointed to something in your, outside of work that actually understand, and be able to navigate government because it makes you super valuable in whatever career you choose.
No, I totally agree with that. I also think navigating bureaucracy teaches you how to be very tactical, and that is a great skill. And last couple things, because here we are with GSPP and our amazing friends at the University of California system, which is such a partner in government in the state. GSPP is, as you said at the beginning, so thank you for saying this, expanding the Sacramento presence, investing in applied learning, really helping support people kind of early career, mid-career. Where do you see the best opportunities for that? Like as you're thinking about collaboration with the UC system, as you're thinking about the workforce, the sort of what we were just talking about, learning new skills, where's the opportunity for deeper collaboration there?
I think the opportunities are all over the place. I know that in the Goldman School, the second year of the MPA program, there needs to be, what's the vocabulary word, Annie? It's like I'd call it a project.
Capstone.
Capstone.
Yeah.
Capstone project. Yeah. So, to me, it's like, the more, I have worked with Goldman students in the past, but like to me, like if you go for an MPA up here with the Goldman School, then you can actually get practical experience in state government and do your capstone project in a way that actually positions you for employment. If I had 2 or 3 hours and maybe a bottle of wine to being creative with you, we could come up with 40 capstone projects that would actually make a difference. There's all this work that we need. That's why we're so excited about the work with CCST and their science fellows and this. There's like so many questions that we need to answer. And I guess what I was surprised about in state government is even though it's 250,000 people, which sounds like, God, too many, but it actually is, we're remarkably thin in a lot of areas. And you think about the statutory, and so actually having those partnerships, and it doesn't have to be somebody embedded for a semester, it could be even answering specific questions, capacity building can be really helpful. And there's great synergy because the student and the program can learn more that they can bring back into the classroom while we benefit because we're getting smart people thinking through our questions.
Yeah, I love that. And one of my capstones, Mel Moyes, is right here, who went from Goldman to a capstone with me to the government. So there's a model right there. I love that idea, and also love, I mean, one of the things that I think the federal government actually does well on this, or did, is letting people go in and out. So go out to do an academic, come in from an academic post for a year and then leave again, or go out to do some kind of a post with a nonprofit or an advocacy group and then come back in again. Fluidity is really, really helpful to keeping people kind of skill levels up. So I wonder if there's ways to do that.
We need to do more of it, but we've got a great case in point. Again, thanks to Julianne and California Council on Science and Technology. For the first time ever, our agency is piloting essentially a scientist in residence. So for the first time ever, I'm going to have a science advisor to the secretary, and that is a scientist, Dr. Andy Jones, who has worked for the last 2 decades at Lawrence Berkeley Lab and has a joint appointment at UC Berkeley. So for a year, he's actually coming in and going to be advising me on thorny scientific issues, but also focused on building partnerships. So I love that suggestion. We need to do more of it. Maybe we do something with the Goldman School. There's like a postgraduate fellowship for a year. We could find some funding. I want to shout out the Moore Foundation as the entity that's actually funding this pilot with the science in residence. So I'm with you. More fluidity, more connective tissue.
And just more experience in different places coming into the government process. Just public services got to be about a lot of things, right? And it's evolving so quickly, I feel like, too, right now. So it's great. It's amazing that you are in a position where you have so many people coming in and out. You are providing mentorship, honestly, and being a model for so many people coming out of this government.
Yeah, and I'll say our fellowships programs. We got our executive fellow, incredible here.
Awesome.
Like there's great ways that students can dip a toe into government, and some of our most effective government leaders actually started in the executive fellow program, in the science fellow program. So that's a really good example, too.
It's I 100% agree with you. Working in government, having that fluidity going in and out, super important. Wade, you're just we're so grateful that you're in the position you're in. Huge inspiration to so many people. And thank you for grappling with these really big questions every day.
Well, huge thanks to you guys. I'm pretty sure that was my wife calling because I have to meet her over at the tree lighting ceremony. So I'm going to dash out. So I don't have a time to visit. But if you're interested in being in touch, there's a generic email. It says Secretary at Natural Resources. My assistant gets that, and we can be in touch that way. Just thanks for your interest and for being here. And there's a lot of important work to get done together.
Thank you, Wade.
Thank you.